Chapter 5. The free trappers were the most rugged and uncompromising individualists on earth. Only now and then did one think of an Indian maid as a wife, even after accepting her in the marriage ceremony of the Red People. But Sam Minard had a sentimental attachment to his mother and to an older sister, and under his bluff and reticent surface were emotional channels in which feeling ran heavy and warm. His closest friends were never to know it. Hank Caddy, Windy Bill, Jim Bridger, George Meek, Mick Boone, and the others who knew him and were to know him best thought that a red woman was for Sam what she was for them, a member of a subhuman species that a man might wish one day to take to bed and the next day to tomahawk. "That burned his possibles," one of them said. "There weren't no human critters except the white. The red ones and the black ones were what the Almighty had in leftovers after making the 12 tribes." Most of the white trappers thought nothing at all of the red man's habit of kicking his old wife squaws into the hills to die of disease, starvation, old age, or to fall prey to the wolves. Sam had a different view of it, but he kept it to himself. Last spring he had seen an Indian lass who took his fancy. Since then he had dreamed about her, and using some thrush and meadowlark phrases, he had tried to compose lyrics to her. The logical part of his mind saw objections to taking a wife. He wondered, for instance, if the physical mating of a girl weighing 115 pounds with a man of his size was the kind an all-wise father would smile on. Sam was sensitive about his size. His mother had told him that at birth he was so huge that his father, after one appalled look, had said he guessed they'd have to name him Samson. It was no fun being so big, and it was a lot of bother. A second objection was her age. She was only about 14 or 15, he thought, and though he was only 27, he seemed to himself middle-aged compared to her. A third objection, he had decided after much thought, was really no objection at all. He suspected that she wasn't all Indian. The Lewis and Clark men had left white blood running in Indian nations all the way from St. Louis to the ocean. Sam had been surprised to learn the origin of the Flathead name. Formerly, they had now abandoned the custom, they had hollowed out a chunk of cedar or cottonwood and spent hours dressing it, carving it, and making it buckskin fancy. This cradle, or pig's trough, or canoe, or caneem, they then lined with cattail down, the fluffy inner bark of old cedar trees, the wool of bighorn sheep, and when it was nicely lined and looked cozy, they slapped it on the poor baby's skull almost the instant it was born, and swaddled its head over with tanned deerskins as soft as the underflank of a baby antelope. Laid out on its back, its black eyes staring at the red wise man, the babe then had a feather or wool shawl drawn across its forehead and around. Finally, a long flat board, attached at one end to the caneem, was forced down on the shawl and the forehead and bound with leather strings, thus putting considerable pressure on the soft bone of the foreskull. The luckless babe was then so securely wrapped and bound that it was unable to move a hand or foot, and did well to wiggle a finger and blink its eyes. In such horrible confinement, it remained a year or more, except in those moments when it was unbound and washed clean of its filth and bounced up and down for exercise. The steady pressure on the skull caused the head to expand and flatten, like a big toad stepped on by a grizzly paw, so that the aspect of the upper face became abnormally broad and the skull flat. The girl of whom Sam was enamored hadn't had her skull flattened. She was, he thought, the loveliest human female he had ever seen. She was lovelier even than the gorgeous alpine lilies, or the columbine with its 5 white petals in a cup framed by the 5D blue sepals. She was a golden brown all over, but for her hair, eyes, and lips. Her hair and eyes were raven black, and her inner lips were of a luscious dark pink that he wanted to bite. Whether she was full grown, he hadn't been able to tell, but she had already had, at her early age, the womanly form, with a kind of full breasts, firm and sitting high, that a man saw on Indian girls only now and then. The quality of her that had most entranced him was what he might have called, had he found words for it, a vivacious surfacing of her emotions, like tossing water spindrift flashing with the jewels of sunlight. And she had a way of looking at a man as though she wished to tease and excite and bewitch him. It had been mighty good to look at, and he was now on his way over to buy her. That would be the most unpleasant part. An Indian chief, whether Flathead, Crow, or Sioux, or even the lowly digger, began to itch all over with avarice the moment he sensed that a pale-face coveted one of his females. If it weren't for the red man's fantastic love of trinkets and trifles, which the white man could buy for a song, the cost of a red wife would have been too much for the trapper's purse. Sam had learned that those who said the red man was not a canny bargainer simply didn't know him. This girl's father, Chief Tall Mountain, had put her up for sale outside her tribe. This proclaimed to every person who knew Indian ways that the greedy rascal thought she was worth 100 times an ordinary red lily. The chief would expect handsome gifts for himself. Then there would be her mother, stepmothers, aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters, step-aunts and step-uncles, step-brothers and step-sisters, and so many cousins that she would appear to be related to every person in the tribe, all hoping for nothing less than a fast horse, a Hawken rifle with 100 rounds, a brace of colts, a bowie, a barrel of rum, a keg of sugar and another of flour, a bushel of beads, and a small mountain of tobacco. The dickering would take weeks if you could put up with it. You'd have to let it drag out for several days, for the reason that a part of the red man's joy in life came from prolonging anticipation of what he knew he could never get. It would be fine if a man could read the price tag and pay it, and swoop his golden brown doll to his chest and ride away. But the red man, whose life was dull but for warpath and occasional feast, squeezed the last emotion out of everything that came his way. Sam well knew that after he had given presents and renewed the pledge of brotherhood, he might have to indulge the old fraud in hours of mysterious silence, while the chief conferred with the more rapacious souls among his ancestors. Or Sam might have to sit for so many hours smoking the spittle-saturated pipe of friendship that his stomach would turn. Or for days he might have to wait while the solemn-faced humbug pretended that a few thousand aunts and cousins were coming in from the distant hills. It would be the same ordeal, no matter what tribe he went to. Around the campfires with other trappers, Sam had paid close attention to their talk about Indian women. Some of the stories he found incredible, such as that of Baptiste Brown, a Canadian, who gave almost 2 quarts of his blood as a part of the bride price, or of Moose Creek Harry, who was tomahawked by his bride on his wedding night. The misogynists among the trappers, such as Lost Scalp Dan, thought all women the curse of the earth, and wouldn't listen to talk about them. But the gallants astonished Sam by the vehemence, sometimes the threats and violence with which they defended their taste in red women. Solomon Silver swore by the Osages, Bill Williams by the Utahs, Rose and Beckworth by the Crows, Jim Bridger by the Snakes, William Bent by the Cheyennes, and Loretto by the Blackfeet. Sam had found different virtues to admire in different tribes. The Utahs made the finest deerskin leather, and unlike the Crows and Arapahoes and Blackfeet, they didn't steal. On the other hand, they would beg until a man loathed the sight of them. A chief would bring forth all the children in the tribe, and they would be crying their heads off and staggering as if with hunger, though there might be enough food stored to last all winter. The Arapahoes placed hospitality next to valor. They set before a guest the best they had and protected his life with their own. Among this people, a man took as many wives as he could pay for, but Sam had decided that one wife for him would be enough. Having met William Bent at Bent's Fort and heard him speak highly of the Cheyennes, Sam had ridden across Cheyenne country. He had been told that the first lodge he entered would be his home as long as he wished to remain, and that lodge had happened to belong to Vipona, or Lean Chief, who had bravely shaken Sam's big right hand and cried, "Hukai hai, Namwit? Welcome, how do you do?" Food and drink had been set before Sam, and after a night in this lodge, he had been favorably impressed by the manners of these people. The lodge, in the form of a cone of poles 18 feet long, set on end, with their tops loosely bound so the smoke could pass through, and covered over with skins and buffalo robes, had the fire in its center. No Indian ever passed between the fire and the person sitting around it. Sam thought it strange that so many of the children had streaks of gray in their black hair, and that the boys to the age of 6 or 7 went completely naked, whereas the girls were clothed from infancy. Lean Chief, observing Sam's appraisal of the marriageable girls around him, explained how it would be if Sam were to bid for one. He would tie his favorite pony to the lodge of the girl's father. If he was acceptable to the father and the girl, the next morning he would find his horse with his father-in-law's horses. If not acceptable, he would find his horse where he had left it, with all the boys of the village around it, hooting and jeering. Sam had thought of taking a wife from the Crows before learning that they were the world's biggest liars and most industrious horse thieves. Just the same, they were such a handsome, high-spirited people that he had twice returned to look at the girls. He had become amused at the way he was looking at the women in different tribes, and wondered if any white man seeking a wife had gone forth to look at French, German, English, Jewish, and other women. All in all, he had found the Indian people to be of middle stature, with lean, straight bodies and fine limbs, their black hair usually flowing loosely over their shoulders, their keen black eyes aglow with the joy of living. Some of them had hair so long that it reached the ground at their feet. Except for those who lived chiefly on fish, they had beautiful white teeth. Practically all the tribes ornamented their garments with porcupine quills, beads, colored stones, feathers, leather fringes, and human hair from the heads of their enemies, dyed various colors. They painted their faces with vermilion, ochre, coal dust, ashes, hump fat, and colorful fruit juices. They wore in their black hair beads, buttons, feathers, shells, stones, and just about anything that gleamed or glittered. It wasn't unusual to see a squaw with 8 or 10 pounds of glass beads attached to her skirt, leggings, and moccasins. All Indians liked to sing, but for white men the sounds they made were not melodic. Their war song would begin on the highest note they could reach, and fall note by note to a guttural grunt, but abruptly it was high and shrill again, and again falling, to rise and fall, until white people who listened felt numbed in their senses and chilled in their marrow. In Sam's opinion, there were no handsomer Indians than the Crows. They were a dashing, colorful people with above-average intelligence. A few white men, like Rose and Beckworth, had become chiefs in the Crow nation and had lived with this people a long time. Though the braves had saddles, they always rode without saddles when hunting wild game, and no other men in the world could match them on a horse. As Windy Bill said, It made the men plain uneasy to see with what fantastic skill they could ride on a dead run, the left heel on top of a ham, the left wrist through a loop of mane, and shoot arrows or guns under the horse's neck, or on a dead run pick up the fallen arrows. But they were a notoriously adulterous people. Bill, who had lived among them, said the men never seemed to be jealous. If they found a wife with a lover, they gave her to a brute who was likely to beat the hell out of her. A Crow warrior's highest ambition in life was to lift 20 scalps and to show such skill and valor that he would be allowed to wear in his hair the feathers of the golden eagle as a badge of courage and rank. One who wore even a single quill was entitled to and received profound deference. One with a half-dozen quills was regarded with awe. On Sam's first visit to the Crows, he was smoking a pipe and for some reason laid his bowie at his side. He became aware of a crow standing by him and of what the brave was doing. The sly thief was standing over the knife and had got it between two of his toes, with a robe from his shoulders almost concealing it. He stood immobile perhaps a minute. Then the foot clutching the knife moved slowly upward into the folds of the robe, and a noiseless hand reached down. At this moment Sam rose swiftly to his feet, and seizing the Indian by his throat and bottom, literally pitched him end over end, with the knife spilling from the robe as he sailed through the air. 3 years later, when the Crows would change the course of his life, Sam was to wonder if it had all begun in that moment. After leaving Kate, he rode up the Musselshell to the Big Bend, and then westward nearly 100 miles, before turning south to the Yellowstone. He rode up the Yellowstone until in hazy distance he could see the mark of its deep gorges, and left it to follow a tributary. For Windy Bill had said he would spend the summer here, hidden from his enemies. Sam was still 5 miles from Bill's camp when he sensed that a horseman was approaching. Sam halted, his rifle across his left arm, and waited. He wasn't at all surprised when he heard a bullet whistle past his ear. It was a way mountain men had with one another. In a few moments Bill came in sight, and he was loud with mock apologies and welcome.
Wall, now, old-timer," he said. "I heard you was under. I surely did. I hear the Blackfoot varmin cut you loose from your possibles, and you was plumb gone beaver."
This was merely the kind of banter that most of the free trappers flung at one another. They all expected to die violent deaths, and so pretended to be amazed on finding a friend still alive. Sam was grinning in his golden beard. But Bill didn't grin when by the supper fire he heard Sam's tale of the woman up the river.
"She was gone beaver," he said. "God in whirlwinds, the wolves would drag the skulls away, and the first Blackfoot to come along would lift her topknot." "I feel awful uneasy about that woman. Why didn't you bring her along?"
Sam said she wouldn't come. It would break her heart to take her away from the graves. Besides, he had thought he would do a little chirking up and get a papoose for his medicine bag. With mock gravity, Bill looked all around him, as though to see this Indian tribe and that one, and decide toward which Sam was taking his romantic interest.
"I don't see no burnt eyes, nor any broken arrows, no Yuncatons, no Payankashas, no cutthroats."
These were all names for members of the Sioux nation.
"It wouldn't be a digger, I don't expect, nor a snake. Just which one are you heading towards now?"
"The Flatheads," Sam said, refilling his tin plate with boiled elk.
"Well, now,"
said Bill,
I think you be acting real plumb smart. I surely do. The Flatheads, they ain't no better varmints. They's the only red people ain't killed a white man yet. But one thing, Sam, I allus figured, the further a man is from his in-laws, the longer his marriage will last. The whole doggone tribe will expect you to feed them if you live within 500 miles.
I had thought of that, Sam said.
The Flatheads were good honey,
said Bill, filling his pipe.
They were scared to death of the Blackfeet, so would never come to visit him, because they would never dare leave home. Did you have his sugar plum picked out?
I saw her last spring.
She might be some other man's filly now.
Might be, Sam said.
Chief's gal?
Tall Mountain.
Wow, a princess,
said Bill. He fixed his large, rather bulging pale blue eyes on Sam's face. He reckoned he had seen the critter a year or two ago when he was pulling leather for Pear's Hole. He knocked his pipe out, filled it, listened to the night sounds, sniffed the breeze coming up the creek, put the glowing end of an ember to his pipe bowl, puffed a few times, his bearded cheeks caving in with each puff, and said,
"Well, now, I wish you luck. I surely do. As for me, 26 winters has snowed on me in these here mountains, and even a nigger or a greaser would larn a few things in all that time. How I could tell bull from cow. I know deer is deer and grizzly paws ain't a woman's soft belly, and a cactus ain't her lips. But I never could find the tracks in a woman's heart."
He was having trouble with his pipe. He put another ember to the bowl and puffed hard, and at last he said,
"Sam, let me tell you, for 10 year I packed me a squaw, a Cheyenne she wore, and the meanest bitch ever bawled for beads. I lodge-poled her on Dead Wolf Creek and traded her for a hawking gun. My next night, love, she wore a crow, and come hell or come high water, that warn't enough beads and red paint in all of Sublet's packs to keep that squaw from crying. I traded that air bitch for a pack horse. Don't get me wrong. I love the women's, but nigh on 3 years I put up with the Wolverine, and she scratched me till I run blood from 100 holes. Then I got me a buffalo grass with dew on it. But let me see. Seems like as how the next was bird singing, a Pawnee, and she warn't no better. I tell you, Sam, if she be female, no matter if redskin, blackskin, or whiteskin, she will torment the life out of you for foo-for-all. Day and night she will. I know mountain men as has tried them all. Even the diggers, even the snakes, even the niggers. And I've been told the nigger she's as sweet as Hank Caddy's honey. But I swear by the old hoss that carried me safe 20 mile, with 50 Blackfeet running out of their skins to lift my hair, that wolf is wolf and female is female, and this old coon can't stand no more. But a young fella like you, he needs a dozen or so. A woman's breast, it's the hardest rock the Almighty made on this old earth, and I can see no sign on it. I could track even a piece of thistle down, but I never could see no tracks in a woman's heart. You plan to come back this way?"
Sam said he ought to. He wanted to see the woman before going south to the Uintas to trap. Bill said he might amble up the river to see if she was all right. It made him powerful uneasy to think of a white woman only a wide river from Blackfeet country, and not a friend in 300 miles.
What was her name?
Don't know, Sam said. She wouldn't talk.
Then she ain't a woman. What should I take her? Jerk buffalo or elk? A big warm robe, if he had an extra? Sugar, salt, flour, and wild flower seeds, if he found any ripe along the way. He would take her a whole pile of stuff,
Bill said.
What's the name, you sugar plum?
Sam stared at his pipe. He had decided that his woman's unpronounceable flathead name would never do, but he hadn't settled on a new name. Some wild flower, maybe. Lily, Daisy, Rose. There weren't many flower names given to women. He might call her Lotus. Bill did nothing to hide his skepticism. After looking at Sam a long moment, he said,
I didn't like the names my squaw, so I give them all the same name. Lucy it was. There were a gal named Lucy I liked when I was a kid. Sam and Lotus. Well, now, you expect to have some little Sams and Lotuses?
Sure, Sam said with a genial grin. 2 maybe, one of each.
Just right,
said Bill.
What ticks on my Johnny? You know, Sam, I must have as many kids as a Mormon bishop. And did you know them Mormons is all coming out here?
Sam turned to look at him.
That's what I heard, Sam. The whole doggone polygamous shittery, Brigham Young and all. In a few years we'll be pushed right out our homes. The Injuns have known it all along. 20 years, 30, there won't be a buffler left. Nothing from hell to breakfast, but damn fools plowing ground and planting cabbages. I are a trapper and a mountain man, but there ain't no future for my kind. They'll push us into Canada and then into the ocean.
Bill knocked his pipe out. He looked around him.
10,000, 20,000, the whole polygamous mess is headed for this country, and if I wasn't a Christian, I'd hope they all starve to death. It makes me sick to my boudins just to think about it.
Me too, said Sam, looking round him and wondering where he could sleep. Most of the mountain men whom he knew flung themselves flat on their backs, arms outflung like a babe's, and snored with a violence that put a quiet sleeper out of his mind. Bill began with low rumblings and whistlings and wheezings that climbed steadily to a crescendo of gulping and roaring, and then to a shattering fortissimo. After a few bars that a man could have heard a mile away, the wild clamor of frog music in Bill's throat seemed to collapse among his tonsils and adenoids, and he gasped and gurgled and seemed about to die, but like a bullfrog with a bad cold, working out sonata variations on a theme, he would then blow out a few tremendous snorts, strangle until his whole body quivered in the torment, and begin again with the rumblings and whistlings in another key. Knowing that he couldn't sleep within 50 yards of Bill, Sam said, "Reckon I'll take a little stroll." Bill turned on him the knowing grin of a man who had had more than his share of women.
"You act restless," he said. "Your Lotus gal will take that out of you."
"I reckon," Sam said. With his rifle he moved away into the woods. When Bill was asleep, he would slip back for his bedroll and go down the creek 100 yards. He looked up at the stars. The constellation said the time was about midnight. Chapter 6. It turned out to be less of an ordeal than Sam had expected. Tall Mountain pretended that 15 or 20 other trappers would be along any day to make offers for his daughter, each with 10 pack horses laden with gifts. Sam smiled at that. The chief feigned astonishment that his brother, Sam Minard, Chief Long Talons, had been able to spend so many moons away from this girl, who was lovelier than wild flowers, the sky, the clouds, and trees in their spring dress. For did the bull elk, eager to mate with a cow, hide in a thicket and sulk in his bull powers? Sam explained in sign language that he had had to catch a lot of beaver to trade for a lot of gifts, including the fine copper kettle he had brought for Tall Mountain, bravest and noblest of all warriors, to cook his elk in. Would he have dared to come with empty pack horse to the greatest chief on earth and offer for his most beautiful daughter a handful of cloudberries and a broken knife? The chief conceded the reasonableness of all that and probed another spot. He said, with words and signs and interpreters, that he had had more trouble than a rabbit in a wolf's den keeping this girl virginal for so long, denying her to other pale-faces who came snorting like studs and with mountains of gifts, turning away immense fortunes that included the fastest horses from the Crow Nation, enough rifles to exterminate the Blackfeet, enough kettles to cook all the buffalo on the prairies, all because he so deeply loved his brother, Chief Long Talons. His grief had been inconsolable. He had become very ill. For such devotion, patience, forbearance, didn't he deserve some special gifts? Brother Long Talons said he surely did, and from his luggage drew forth a 2-gallon keg of rum. When Tall Mountain's black eyes saw what it was, there came into them the joy seen in the eyes of small children. His bronze face smiled. He was ready to get drunk. Sam Minard never drank. In such frontier towns as St. Louis and Independence, and at trading posts, he had seen men full of rum and slow on the draw go staggering off with blood gushing from their wounds. Now, with every amenity and duty fulfilled, he traded ammunition for a tough, fleet pony and a buckskin bridle, handed its reins to his black-eyed child wife, hung a revolver and a knife from her slender waist, and rode off into the south. She had no saddle, but she had a robe under her. "Squaw horse," he had said, slapping the beast she sat on. He would teach her English, for he wanted his children to speak English. "Squaw hitch," he touched a packer's knot on the pack horse. "Saddle tree, stirrup, horn, latigo." He had decided that blood from a Lewis and Clark man was running in her veins, and he hoped that man was John Coulter. While he studied her complexion, she had looked at him with sober, childlike interest. Like all Indian girls, she heard that the pale men were cruel to their women. Perhaps she was wondering how far from her people she would be when he knocked her senseless and tossed her out, but she responded to his words with open lips and a flash of her teeth. "Lotus," he said, tapping her gently. "Mrs. Lotus Minard." Her open lips said, "Lotus, Lotus, my golden brown biscuit." "Biscuit?" "Biscuit, my Injun filly, my wife." Around them had stood hundreds of Indians, their black eyes staring. Cocking her head at her sisters in the manner of a bird, she had said, pointing to Sam, "Long Talons." Chief Long Talons and Princess Samson Minard. It'll be a hell of a day for both of us if you turn out to be Delilah. Delilah Lotus, that's you." "Sam," she said. She knew his white name. Tall. Her people on his first visit had asked him what he was. He had held his hand about 6 feet 4 inches above the earth and had said, "Tall." As he rode south from the village, with Lotus trailing him, he was thinking that for a few days they would be safe in Flathead Land. These Indians not only had never killed a white man or robbed or deceived one. So far as white men knew, they were noted for their courage, prudence, candor, and piety. Their children were taught never to fight, except in self-defense, or, as the Indians put it, never to go hunting for their own graves. A tenet of their faith forbade them to seek vengeance. How, Sam wondered, riding along the eastern flanks of the Bitterroots, would Lotus want to train their children? Most Indian fathers were sentimental fellows who doted on their sons, crooning to them and telling them tales of valor. But they had little patience with one who showed cowardice or rebelled against tribal disciplines. Sam had seen a 6-year-old crow son in a screaming tantrum in midwinter and had looked on with amazement as the father poured pail after pail of ice water over the shrieking and shivering lad. He had seen mothers set naked babies only a few months old outside in the snow and leave them for 10-15 minutes. When the infants were brought into the warmth of the lodge, they had waved their arms and howled with delight. Hank Caddy had once said, in one of the rare evenings when he uttered more than 10 words, that he could foresee the time when white children wouldn't be worth knocking on the head. Well, Sam Minard's would be wonderful, a boy and a girl, and he would love them like the old Dickens. He gave his Lotus the first of many surprises when he dismounted, took a Don Giovanni stance, and burst into baritone song, pretending that she was Donna Elvira's maid, and that the horse she sat on was a window ledge. He serenaded her, giving to the aria all the soul he had. If she had a voice, he would teach her to sing. He again astonished her when they stopped to make camp. She had supposed that her lord would smoke his pipe while she gathered wood for a fire, fetched water, and prepared supper for him. But Long Talons lifted her off her pony, held her to him a few moments with her feet 10 inches off the earth, his lips kissing in her black hair, and then made a fire and set out a supper of dried buffalo, stale biscuits, and a pot of coffee. A hell of a marriage feast, he told her, but there would be better tomorrow. He opened a tin of sugar, and touching a fingertip to his tongue, to moisten it, touched the sugar and again his tongue. He then took her hand, touched her finger to his tongue and to the sugar, and kissed the sugar of her finger. When he looked at her eyes, there was such childlike wonder in them that he had to smile. While he was setting the food out, and she was wondering what kind of man this could be who did the labor for women, she looked round her and saw bushes black with berries. Seizing a cup, she hastened away and returned with the cup brimming. Sam poured half the berries into her tin plate and half into his own and sprinkled sugar over both. "I see you'll make a good wife," he said, and again astonished her when, bending low, he turned her face up and kissed her berry-stained lips. Blessed Eros! It was good to have a bride in your arms and be riding away over the world. It was good to be for a few days in friendly country, where a man could sleep. He was more than 200 miles from the Blackfeet, 400 from the Crows, 600 from the Utahs. After they had eaten, She stared at him, fascinated, as he washed the dishes in a cool mountain stream. For most Indians, the only dishcloth was a dog's tongue. He hobbled the beasts, piled bedding against a tree, leaned against the bedding, filled and fired his pipe, and then, looking over at Lotus, said gently, "Come to your man." She must have understood his eyes, if not his words, for she moved over until he could take her arm and drew her down at his side. He snuggled her comfortably against the robes, put his strong left arm around her, and looking up at the sky said, "Look down, Almighty One, and see your Adam and Eve here in the garden. She fed me the berry apples, but we will sin after she gets used to me." Looking round at her face, he said softly, "Poor little Lotus, Lila, left all your people to go with me. I'll be a good husband." That wasn't what he wanted to say. He guessed he wasn't much of a gallant. She would look up to meet his eyes, but he could read nothing in the black depths. His left arm drew her a little closer. His left cheek sank to the lustrous warmth of her hair. His temple moved down till it touched her temple. Then he held his breath, for he could feel her pulse beating against him at 100 throbs a minute. Putting his pipe aside, he sat up straight, and taking her hands, laid them bags down across his big left palm. He then studied the lines. As a youngster, he had known what some of the lines were supposed to mean. It looked to him as if the lifeline had been chopped off at the shoulders. But in another line there were 2 children, and that was good. He brought her hands to his bearded mouth and kissed both palms. Then he turned toward her, and framing her face, tried to look deep into her black eyes, but it was like looking into a bottle of black ink with a light under it. He patted her knees, again put his left arm round her, and taking up his pipe, filled it from a deerskin pouch. It was while he was tamping the tobacco that she moved swiftly away from him and returned with a glowing ember. A few minutes later he again put his pipe aside and took his mouth harp. In turn he played and sang Au clair de la lune, a French chanson of the 18th century, the troubadour song Green grows the laurel, but in the middle of this he broke off to tell her that far south in Kit Carson land they were calling it lilacs. He would play a phrase, sing it, and play it again, and all the while she intently watched him, like a child determined to understand. Flies in the pemmican, skip to my lotus, flies in the pemmican, skip to my lotus, flies in the pemmican, skip to my loo. She gave him a marvelous smile for that. She knew the word pemmican. You know, Mrs. Minard, I think I'll send for a banjo. Banjo, banjo. While pretending to strum an instrument, he made banjo sounds with his lips. When he left home, the only banjo he knew was the long-necked fretless instrument used in black-faced minstrel shows, English ballads, and popular Irish and Scottish tunes of the day. A letter from his brother David said there was now a banjo with 5 strings and frets in the fingerboard, and that the playing style was changing from chording to a developed solo. That all sounded good. Hey, Jim along, Josie, hey, Jim along, Joe. She smiled at him. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, both backs and palms, and then the fingers. He thought they were getting along all right. When the moon was round and melon-ripe, like the one up there, He wanted to make his mouth organ sound like a French horn, so that he could play a horn solo. He wanted to express the music in winds, the murmuring lullabies in flowing waters, the exquisite bird arias, the great lover's sighs made by trees, for the Almighty, his father had told him, had the finest orchestras and the most magnificent symphonies in the world. It was his father who had told him that Knecht's musical portrait of nature had fertilized the soil for Beethoven's pastoral symphony. On the pianoforte his father had striven to paint tones, to evoke mental images with auditory impressions. On his mouthpiece Sam could do a fair imitation of the flute, cello, and oboe, but he failed completely when he tried to bring forth the round golden bell tones of the horn. "What fun we'll have," he said, squeezing her. "No taxes, no policemen, no government, no neighbors, no preachers, only the four of us, eating and sleeping, playing and singing." He turned and lightly kissed her forehead, cheeks, lips, but she gave no response. He had thought that Eve was the same in all women. Did she know that some of the finest singers on earth were birds? On their long ride south, they would hear the meadow lark, the hermit thrush, the wood thrush, the grosbeak, the oriole. He guessed he would have one more pipeful, and they would roll in. Standing, he looked at the bluff above them and at the country round about, to be sure that the only approach an enemy could make was from the front. He then sat, and while he smoked and looked at his wife, her gaze moved over his face, as though to fix it in memory, or as though marking the differences between red faces and white. He supposed she didn't know what to make of white man music, or of his kissing, for the red men didn't kiss their women. Perhaps she was wondering when he was going to take her, with the brutal and savage passion with which most of the males of the mammalia took their females. Poor little Lotus, she would have a few more days of peace. Yes, it was a Mozart moon. September was almost here. At this season, the nights in the high northern mountains seemed to have been lifted off the glaciers, but he had plenty of bedding. Putting his pipe away, he rolled her into a buffalo robe as though she were a doll. Raising the part on which her head lay, he dragged pine needles and twigs under the fur so that she would have a kind of pillow, though he wasn't sure that the red people used pillows, and he put the revolver and knife within a fold of the robe, within swift reach of her hand. If enemies came, he said to her, he would get 4, and she must get 2. He now wrapped a robe around him and lay at her side, with a rifle between them. 1,000 stars were out, and the moon among them looked like a round golden note from a French horn. Sam wasn't a religious man in the sense of creeds and churches, but he felt a powerful affinity to the earth and to the heavens and to all the living things around him, except the professional killers. He looked at the moon and the stars and began to talk. He told his silent and listening bride that the Almighty had created a beautiful world, and that the Rocky Mountains, the Cordilleras of the continental spine, or stony or snowy mountains, as some men called them, were the marrow, heart, and soul of it. He hadn't seen them, but common sense told him that by comparison the Andes were only foothills and the Alps were for children to climb. This conceit made him grin in the robe. Together they would explore the Gallatin and Madison and 100 other valleys, the Tetons, the Bighorns, the Green River, Columbia, the Blue, the Big Belt, and 1,000 peaks that any man alive and joyful wanted to reach the top of, and the rivers and lakes and the high white cascades against the snow lines. Why any man would willingly live in a city with its infernal stinks and noises, he would never know. Why a man would live back there among the hummocks cold mountains east of the Mississippi, when he could come west to God's finest sculpturings, both Greek and Gothic, and be his own lord and king and conscience, with no laws except that the brave survived and the cowardly perished, and no asylums for crazy men who could no longer look at the city life without shrieking, and no churches except this in which she lay, no priests except the larks and wrens and thrushes, no Bible except this land's language for those who could read it. This was the life he loved. This was where he would live until an arrow or a bullet found him. And when that hour came, he would be content to let the wolves strip his bones clean and leave them upon this great map of the magnificent. The girl lying at his side understood only a few of his words, but she understood the emotion, for in its essence his mood was her mood. She was thrilled by both felicity and fright when his hand moved over to touch her, to squeeze her arm, or once to spread out flat on the robe over her navel. Strong emotion, she understood. For her own people, all the red people, were supercharged, but she didn't understand a man, white or brown, who for hours would do no more to his woman than to her. She would never know that for the pure glory of it, a romantic man was falling in love. The next day her astonishment and wonder continued to grow. He tarried in friendly land, turning aside from his straightest course to camp by a mountain lake. He looked at the cold, high mountain water and told himself that he needed a bath. In his sly but human way, he wanted to see his wife with no garments on her. He sniffed at his arms, but the only odor there was the smoke essences used to tan buckskin. Like all the free trappers, whose lives depended solely on their alertness and courage, he had many times saturated his leather clothing in the smoke of burning cedar, sage, and stinkbush to overcome the human scent. The odor of smoke, tanned skins, and beaver pelt was about the only odor he had. But because he was a bridegroom and liked the smell of human hair and skin, freshly washed, he wanted a bath. After tying the horses and placing his weapons where he could swiftly seize them as he stripped off his clothing, he knew that his wife was watching him. He supposed she was wondering if he intended to strip her down. Poor frightened doe! Did she think her hour had come for rape? He made a sign to her to take her garments off, and in a few moments she stood naked. But he had already plunged into the cold waters and was swimming. Then he stood, treading water, looking over at her, with water running down the strands of his long hair. After she entered, he swam to the shore, and using sand for soap, scrubbed himself. He then plunged in again and swam like a bull buffalo compared to his wife, who swam high and swift like an antelope. Standing in water to his waist, Sam watched her. As though to show off her skill, she swam 30 yards to his left, turned with such ease that she seemed to be on a tow line, and swam to his right, and then came straight toward him. He could have been no more enchanted if she had been a mermaid. She stood before him, the water almost to her chin, her black hair down her back in a wet tangled mane, her wet face as grave as a child's, as black eyes looked up at him. "You swim a lot better than your man," he said. "I hope you shoot that well." Moving close to her and reaching into the water, he put his right arm under her knees and his left across her back and brought her up. He waded ashore and stood in full sun, holding her dripping body, looking at the beauty of her bronzed Indian skin, at her breasts, which he thought perfect, at her lovely throat and shoulders, and at last at her eyes. What he thought he saw in her eyes he had no words for. It was as if he had lived for 27 years within the prison of self, without communicating a single time to another living soul, to find now, in the miracle of this moment, that he was not alone. He guessed that was what love meant. Still holding her with one arm under her knees and the other under her back, he raised her so that his lips could touch her, from her knees to her lips. Kissing over her, he moved her back and forth with such ease that she seemed to be weightless. He tossed her with a turning motion, and in mid-air caught her, with his fingers now spread against her thighs and against her chest just below her breasts, and he put his lips to her thighs and up her back to her nape and her hair. He tossed her again, and with spread hands caught her at her waist and set her on her feet. With a tentative, timid forefinger, she touched him gently on the upper muscle of his powerful right arm. She hadn't known that there were men with such strength. She now would have been only a little surprised if Mick Boone had told her that he had seen this man, to whom she had been sold for good or ill, take two Indians of average size by their necks and smash their heads together with such power that they both dropped dead. That Sam could put a palm with fingers spread against her belly and lift her to arm's length above his head with the ease with which most men would have lifted an infant, and that he could go under the belly of any beast in her father's herd, and with hands grasping his legs below his knees could put all 4 feet of the horse off the earth. Her eyes said that she knew he was a mighty one. She was looking at his hands. Taking the mouth organ from his medicine bag, he played here and there in a few things, trying to find what he wanted. And having found it, he began to dance solo, back and forth, across the lakeshore sands, and a bronzed girl, glistening with melting diamonds, her black mane covering her whole back, stood still and looked at him. He would never know whether the wonderful melody went like the hermit thrush's song into her mood. For him it was like the scent of warm, melting wild honey, like the spring song of the bluebird, like an armful of alpine lilies. He then put the harp away, sniffed the atmosphere and listened, and heard only the sweet low note of the water thrush. He then walked over to his bride. What he did astonished and frightened her. Bending over and putting his left arm behind her knees, he lifted her, straightened, gave her an upward thrust with his left arm and right hand, so that in the next moment she sat on his left shoulder and walked over to her close. There he let her slide down to his left arm, and as she sat, like a big golden bird, staring at him, he looked at her eyes and smiled. Adam and Eve were measuring the wonder of one another. He then uttered words which once spoken he would find 10 times as hard to say again. Lotus, Lila, I reckon this white nigger loves you. She was his wife, his woman, his mate, his companion on the trail as long as there were trails for free men to ride on, through the valleys until these were choked with cabbages and people, and up the mountains to the highest peaks, as long as men felt compelled to see God. He set her down and they began to dress. He thought she was surrendering to his maleness, but he was not ready to take her, not yet. There was a huge emptiness in him to be filled, and so little of it that could be filled with sexual passion. When they were both dressed, he turned to her, where she stood, waiting and looking at him, and putting his arms across her shoulders under her hair, he held her close to him, murmuring down at her, "Mine, all mine." Then, putting hands under her arms at the shoulders, He held her straight out, at arm's length, and looked at her. With her feet still off the earth, her wonderful black lustrous eyes looking at him, he fetched her close against him, from her toes to her face, and pressed his bearded mouth into her hair. "Well," he said, releasing her, "I reckon we best be on our way. You won't be eating bitterroots for a long time." The bitterroot, which her people called spetlum, and boiled until it was like a fondant, was far too bitter for the white man's taste. Because she and her people had not lived sumptuously in the way of the crows, he was eager to cook feasts for her on the long journey south. He hoped to get grouse for supper. "You like grouse?" he asked her. "Geese, quail." He tried to imitate the calls of these birds. The song or talk of the prairie chicken was so startling and in ways human that it gave a man a queer feeling, and the quail and white-winged dove could lift the hair on his neck. He imitated the cries by pinching his nostrils and honking and whistling, and by fluffing his hair to make feathers and flapping his hands to make wings. He made her laugh for the first time. That for him meant that his marriage was getting along. Chapter 7. Sam had never thought much about love. He had had good parents. He had never as a child felt unwanted and unloved. His father, a rather ineffectual giant whose chief passions were music and philosophy, and who was sometimes found reading Descartes and Locke and Tom Paine when he should have been tending his small general store, had far more interest in Descartes' effort to attain to the knowledge of all things than he had in the family larder. Sam took his love of music from his father, his practical sense in a world where a man had to adapt or perish, and his love of adventure and freedom he took from his English mother. His father was French and Scotch, with generous measures of still other peoples. He had, Sam had concluded, so many strains in him that they were constantly at war with one another. But he loved learning while his mother loved life. Daniel Minard had a library, small but excellent, and a hankering to write a book some day. Sam thought he might write a book if he ever left the West and went back home. Some of the mountain men were about as illiterate as a man could be, such as Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, neither of whom, it was said, could read or write. Some were educated. Some had written books about their adventures in the West. At 19, Sam had told his parents that he guessed he would go out beyond the Mississippi and take a look around. He had intended to stay only a year or so, but in the frontier town of Independence he had been fascinated by tales of Kit Carson and other mountain men. Then one day he threw a bully over his shoulders with such force that he broke both the man's arms and fled from the law, as many young men had before him. Long before his first vision of the Tetons, he knew that the free trappers were his people, and that these mountains would be his home. On his way out he had gathered all the tales he could of the men who had gone before him. There was Edward Rose, who, if still alive, was an old cuss now. Negro, Cherokee, and white, Rose had worn, said those who knew him, the most fiendish expression this side of hell. His face scarred with old knife wounds, a crooked lip pulled into a perpetual snarl, and eyes as cruel and cold as the falcon's. Most of his nose had been chewed off. He had an ugly brand on his forehead that some enemy had put there with a red-hot iron. He had buckshot and bullets in both legs, and like Jim Bridger, he had for a time carried an arrowhead embedded in the flesh of his back. About 35 years ago he had come west and joined the Crows and had become a powerful chief, and because of his reckless courage in battle against the Crows' red enemies, his name had been changed from Cut-Nose to Five Scalps. Jim Beckworth, who had also become a Crow chief, said Rose was killed about the time Hugh Glass had his dreadful fight with a grizzly. But there were those who said that Beckworth was the biggest liar in the West, next to Bridger. It was Caleb Greenwood, squawman, mountain man, and scout who had changed Beckworth's life and made him the devil's own brother. As the story came to Sam, Caleb and a few companions had unwittingly killed a couple of crows, and still had the two wet scalps when half the Crow nation surrounded them. To save the lives of his men, Caleb had convinced the Crow chief that Beckworth was a Crow, that when a band of Crows had been captured by the Cheyennes, Jim was a Crow boy among those captured. Years later, when Beckworth and Bridger were fleeing for their lives, Beckworth was captured and taken to a Crow village. Having seen him with Greenwood, several Crows recognized him as a brother, and so all the older women were summoned and told to examine this man, to see if they could identify a lost son. An old crone, who had inspected almost every part of him, said at last that if he had a mole over his left eyelid, he was her son. When the lids were pulled down, like two small rubber awnings, as pure as gumption, there was the mole. During the next hours, Beckworth almost died under the welcome. The enraptured hugging and squeezing of him by scores of shrieking sisters and aunts and cousins had made him feel, Jim said, as if he had been rolled over and over in a ton of fresh bois de vache. But he survived it to become a famous Crow chief, and for years had his choice of both women and horses, their only recognized form of wealth. It was said that he became enamored of a girl warrior who had sworn never to roll under for a man, but to give her life to the extermination of her people's enemies. Jim boasted that he had won her, but no one believed his story, for even Jim Bridger said that as a liar he had no peer. It was a sad day for him when, growing weary of women and horses, he wandered away. On his return to the Crows, he was promptly poisoned so that they could keep his brave heart, the house of his phenomenal daring. Sam hadn't even seen Rose or Beckworth or a dozen other free trappers haloed by legends, but he had met Kit Carson, the most famous man of them all. Kit had served as scout for an explorer, and so many pages had been written about him back east that the greenhorns had made him a national idol. Sam had seen the Scot and Kentuckian twice, and had looked hard at him. In an average group of mountain men, Kit looked more like a boy. He stood in his moccasins only about 5 feet 8 inches in height, and weighed, Sam guessed, no more than 150 pounds. He had sandy hair, bowed legs, freckles, and steady, steely blue eyes. It was said that he had killed a lot of men and lain with a lot of women and been in a lot of fights. When only a lad, his family had taken the trail of Daniel Boone, and when only 9, Kit had seen his father killed by a falling tree. At 16, he headed west. When in an accident a man's arm was crushed, all the men with him said they didn't have the nerve to saw it off. Kit, only a youngster, said he would saw it off if they would hold him, and with a dull old saw he went through the bone of the upper arm, cauterized the wound with a red-hot king bolt, and said he guessed the man would be all right. Such tales about him had made Sam look at him hard. It was also said that Kit was a romantic cuss who didn't think that woman, white or red, was something to embrace and then kick into the nearest river. Kit's taste ran to the black-eyed Spanish and Mexican lasses in the Taos area, for whom kissing a man or stabbing him was all the same thing. Sam had seen some of the senoritas and had thought them bundles of vanity and violence. He preferred his Lotus, and by the end of a week it would have taken a lot of big spacious words to express the full scope of his feeling for her. She was mother, wife, daughter, trail maid, an angel, and the soul of his medicine bag. He had been teaching her to handle both rifle and revolver, and to throw the knife. She was an apt pupil with all weapons, and English. In the vacuum, where for 7 years he had known only eating and killing and dodging his enemies, he now enthroned her, and she began to fill him, and his emotions enfolded her as she enfolded him, until on awakening she would be the first thing he would think of, and the last before falling asleep. Heaven help the man, white or red, whoever dared touch her. Possibly he was afraid that man would, for during these blissful golden autumn weeks with her, he never let her out of his sight for more than a few minutes. He found to his astonishment and delight that the sexual embrace had endeared him to her. Before that she had stood off as though to measure the depth of his villainy. After that she would come up to him shyly and look up at his eyes. At night he would lie, naked, on his robe and hold her naked against him. He would let her lie on her back, down his chest, belly and thighs, the top of her head just under his chin, her toes barely reaching his ankles. Sometimes they would fall asleep that way, with a robe over them. He called her his golden bottom, his twin apples, the house of his son, and a score of other foolish endearments, while his big hands moved tenderly over her. Sometimes he would sit with Lotus on his lap and look for a full minute into her wonderful eyes, and she would look into his blue-gray eyes, her gaze moving from one to the other, back and forth. Sam would look and never say a word, as a man might try to look through an opaque pane into heaven. Sometimes she would tickle him in his beard or over his chest, and though her face was sober, he could see laughter in her eyes. "Love me?" she would say. "You doggone right I love you." "Supper?" "Loin steaks and strawberries." Looking into her eyes, he would think of Loretto, who had come west a few years before Sam, a hot, impetuous Spaniard who had ransomed from her enemies and captors, the Crows, and taken as his wife a beautiful Blackfeet girl. A year later, he and his wife and their baby were with Jim Bridger and his men, when they came on a band of Blackfeet, and the girl, recognizing a brother, handed the babe to Loretto and fled to his arms. Then the Indians moved swiftly away, taking protesting and weeping girl with them, and Loretto, the babe in his arms, went crying after them, begging his wife to come back. A Blackfeet chief then advanced to meet him and said his life would be spared if he would shut up and go away. That was the price of his life, but not of his love. He lived and waited for the moment when he would see her again, and the truth of his abiding love for her became a lovely legend all over the West. Most white men found it strange that a white man could love an Indian girl, and made the matter agreeable to their prejudice by saying that a Spaniard, after all, was not white, but a cousin of the red people. Did Loretto ever see her again? The legend said he did not. Sam hadn't thought much about the story before he held his Lotus close to him and felt the living wonder of her. After that he thought about it every time he looked into the lights and the melting liquid black of her eyes. In a high mountain meadow they found ripe wild strawberries, and on a hillside the young fat barren elk cow. The supper tonight would be a feast. There wouldn't be cream for the berries, or sourdough bread and wild honey or hump fat for butter, but it would be a feast just the same. taking her in his arms, he said, "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine." "Yes," she said, and then did something that surprised him. From the berries she chose one of the largest and ripest, and this she crushed across his lips. She then crushed the berry over her lips, and standing tiptoe, looked up at him and said, "You drink?" "I'll be doggone," he said, and looked across her hair at the sky. Then he kissed her. He said, loving the scent of the berries and the taste of the kiss. He kissed her again. He had tried to teach her the meaning of the word "what" by taking an object, saying "what" and naming it. She now looked up at him after the second kiss and said, "Lotus, what?" He pulled his bronzed forehead down in thought. "A fruit," he said. It was the fruit, the lotus, people ate that made them drunk. He turned to the berries. "Lotus. What? This." "Oh," she said, sucking the meaning into her. She thought the lotus was the wild strawberry. She stood looking at the berries. He supposed she was telling herself he had named her for this delicious fruit. She seemed deeply pleased. Knowing that he could not always be present to protect her, he spent many hours teaching her to shoot and throw the knife. Most Indians didn't have rifles, and the few who had rifles never allowed their women to touch them. The recoil of the sound of the explosion frightened her at first, but she was determined and apt. After 50 rounds, she could hit an object the size of a man's head at 50 yards. The heavy revolver she could never master, but she practiced daily with a knife. It was James Black who began making the knives, who hardened and tempered the steel with a method he never divulged to any man. After James Bowie, with a knife made by Black, ripped open 3 assassins who had been hired to kill him, the knife became known as the Bowie, and it became so well known and widely used that schools sprang up in which fighting with a Bowie was taught. Sam, on his way west, had spent time in one of these schools. The real Bowie had a guard and a razor edge on top of the blade, from the point back about 2.5 inches. For throwing, a knife was machined and balanced to turn over once, twice, or 3 times in a certain distance. Sam had had his knife balanced to turn twice in 30 feet. At that distance he could drive it through a man's heart. He taught his wife to throw it, because in his opinion it was the best weapon in close fighting. You could throw it faster than you could get your rifle up, and you could rip open 3 men while trying to shoot one. He said he would get her a Bowie at Bridger's Post, and a lot of other things. They would be in debt, but in the next winter he hoped to get 4, perhaps 5 packs of beaver. Did she know how many pelts were in a pack? A pack, he tried to tell her in words and signs, had 10 buffalo robes, 14 bear, 60 otter pelts, 80 beaver, 120 fox, or 600 muskrat. 4 packs of beaver would be 320, and that should be $700 at a post or rendezvous. She knew the word rendezvous, and she asked if it would be 6 moons. More than that. He pulled all her fingers and thumbs out straight, and starting with a thumb said, "This thumb is October, forefinger November, big one December, except it isn't very big." He said and kissed it. "This is January. The little one is February, as it should be. This other thumb is March, and the forefinger is April. About 7.5 moons." He turned his thumbs in and held up his 8 fingers. From the Bitterroots they had gone southeast to the Continental Divide and had crossed it just north of Henry's Lake. From there they went to Pierce Hole and climbed the backbone of the Teton Range and looked east, across what would be known as Jackson Hole country. On the eastern flanks of this range, high against the spine, were more white flowers than Sam had ever seen in one spot. Whole acres, whole hillsides, with such a wealth of color and scents that he could only stand and stare. He knew only a few of them: the asters, paintbrushes, penstemons, gilias, mallows. None of them for him was as lovely as the marsh marigold, which he called the alpine lily or the Alp lily, with their yellow centers and 6 creamy white petals, and the columbine. But he loved them all, and marveled at the beauty of this mountainside. Among the flowers, as if to set them off, were the ferns, the leathery leaves of myrtle, the mountain laurel, and various berry plants, including the huckleberry. And the huckleberries were ripe. Sam gathered a few of the loveliest flowers and intertwined the stems in her black hair. Some day, he said, he would make her a mantle of the mariposa lily, white, lilac, yellow, and red. While she gathered berries, he went down the mountain to a spring to fill the coffee pot, for they would have their supper on the summit, with the Almighty's magnificent sculpturing all around them. This, he said, was the greatest elk country in the world, and yonder, only 100 miles, the buffalo were so thick they turned the prairies black. He stood a few moments, looking into the northeast. Up there, a long way, was a sad and lonely woman, and he guessed they ought to go see her. It was dark by the time he came in with the loin, liver, and a hind quarter of an elk. In a natural room, high and fragrant, formed by dense evergreen tangles, he made a fire and set on the coffee and steaks. Lotus had gathered 2 quarts of berries. The huckleberry, Hank Caddy said, was the finest in the world. Every autumn he gathered gallons and decocted his delicious jam, using wild honey and a little sugar to help inspissate the fruit. Remembering how Hank used berry juice and hot marrow, Sam now fed his wife as though she were a bird. He opened a hot biscuit, poured melted marrow over it, supped it then in huckleberry juice, and presented it at her lips. He would then take one, and shutting his eyes tight, so that he would have no sensation but that of taste and smell, he made murmuring sounds of pure joy. The warmth brought out the full marvelous scent and flavor of the berry. Other delicacies Sam prepared for her in the warm, scented room under the fir boughs. Over a morsel of raw liver, well heated, he sprinkled a very little pepper, then poured hot marrow over it, and plopped it into her mouth. Imitating him, she would close her eyes when she chewed. He would kiss her lips when they were moist with marrow fat or berry juice. They spent 2 nights and a day here, feasting on wild game and wild fruits, and then descended to a beautiful lake and went past the majestic blue-gray granite towers of the Tetons. 2 days later they were at the southern edge of what would be known as Yellowstone Park. That was the area of John Coulter's hellhole and hot bilins, steaming vents and spoutings and mud pots. In a geyser basin they could be safe all fall and winter. The red people seldom ventured close to the huge vomitings of hot water or to that part of the lake where hot springs boiled in the cold depths. The journey north to see if the woman was still there would be an extra 800 miles, but a mountain man thought little of that. There wasn't much to do before the snows of winter. Besides, he thought the woman might come to her senses if she were to see another woman. As they entered Crowlands, they both steeped themselves and their garments in the smoke of woods with a strong incense, such as cedar, sage, and buffalo bush. And Sam put his music and his songs away, and no longer talked above a whisper. As his manner changed, so did hers. She became as noiseless as the weasel. After they had gone north, past the Bighorns, and come close to Blackfeet country, Sam put away his pipe and built no more fires. They would now eat jerked elk, roots, and dried berries. Lotus's people, like the Shoshanes, had long been preyed on by the Blackfeet and lived in chronic fear of them. Sam had told himself 1,000 times that he must never fall into their hands. The Crows, the Cheyennes, even the Sioux might ransom him, but the Blackfeet squaws would dance round and round him like shrieking things out of hell, and piece by piece hack the flesh off his bones. He knew with what hellish glee Blackfeet warriors would make off with his wife if they ever got hands on her, so he became so wary as the wolf, and Lotus became more hunted animal than human being. Smell of the Blackfeet always made Sam think of John Colter. Had there ever been another such race with death as his? Surprised with a companion by 500 warriors in the Three Forks area when trapping, John hadn't resisted. The fool companion had been shot full of arrows. John was given a chance. It was a mighty slim chance, but it was a chance of a kind, and Sam could imagine with what eagerness the man had seized it. There he was, stripped naked, defenseless, 500 howling savages around him, his companion lying dead in his blood. Even his moccasins were taken off. He was told that he could run for his life with the 500 at his heels. Colter had not only to run barefooted, he had to cross a wide area that was densely studded with cactus, whose thorns were as sharp and stout as needles. Sam had crossed the area over which John ran and had examined the thorns. He supposed that a man running not only for his life but to escape torture would hardly be aware of the spines driven into his naked feet. What had the soles of Colter's feet been like after 300 yards? After 3 miles, Colter had glanced back and seen a gloating buck only 100 yards behind him. Calling on what had seemed to Colter to be the last of his strength, he had tried to run faster and soon began to hemorrhage, the blood bursting from his nostrils and spilling down over him. At the end of another mile, a backward glance appalled him. Now the red warrior was only 40 or 50 feet behind him and was in the act of hurling his lance. In that instant, Colter made his decision. He stopped short and turned. Possibly his body, red with blood, unnerved the Indian, for he seemed to make only a feeble effort, then stumbled and fell, and in the next moment Colter was on him, and with the lance spiked him to the earth. At least 200 of the howling savages were still swiftly advancing, spears flashing in the sun. Blood still spilled over him, but Colter now ran with the energy of despair, and came at last to a river. He plunged in. His life was saved by the fact that he came to the river at a large eddy, covered over with driftwood. He dived and swam, came up a moment to gulp air, and dived and swam again, and so kept swimming under and coming up until he was 100 yards from the shore. He then found above him a huge cottonwood trunk with a lightning wound in the underside of it. By lying on his back, he could put his face up in the cavity of the wound and breathe. For hours he lay under that tree, while above him went the baffled and shrieking warriors, leaping from driftwood to driftwood, and insane with rage, because they had lost their fleetest runner and their prey. After Colter was convinced that they had gone, he cautiously left his hiding place and looked round him. He didn't leave the eddy until the blackest part of the night. He then swam quietly down river several miles and sat on the bank to consider his plight. The soles of his feet were filled with thorns. He had no clothes, no weapons, no food, and he was at least a week's journey from the nearest white man on the Rush John River. But because he was John Colter and a mountain man, he made it, with nothing to eat in 7 days and nights of torture but a few roots. It made a mountain man proud just to think of him. It made him proud to think of Hugh Glass, who, torn open front and back by a grizzly and left to die, had crawled 100 miles on his hands and knees, with maggots swarming in his wounds. There were so many to be proud of. There was Jedediah Smith, as intrepid an explorer as Meriwether Lewis. Jed, who carried a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, who prayed in one moment and blew his foe's head off in the next. In an encounter with a grizzly, his head had been seized by the monster's mouth, and huge chiseled teeth had raked furrows in flesh and bone and torn one ear almost off. Jed had had the ear sewed to his skull with a crude needle and buckskin thread. It was a riddle, Sam thought, listening to the night sounds and moving a hand caressingly back and forth over his wife's thighs. It was a riddle how the grizzly managed to get so many heads in its mouth. There was Louis Dawson on the Rio de las Animas Perdidas. In his fight with a bear, his companion's gun had missed fire 3 times. 3 times a bitch dog had attacked so furiously that the bear had turned to chase her, and 3 times the beast had returned to maul Dawson. 3 separate times it had Dawson's entire head in its mouth, and his wounds, like Jed's, were stitched together with leather thread. But one big tooth had gone through the skull, and after 3 days the brains began to leak out, and Dawson died in delirium. How will I die? Sam wondered, and sniffed the night air for scent of Blackfeet. How would Lotus die? He was sure that neither of them would die in bed. Few white men in this land had sense enough, when eyes and trigger finger began to fail, to pack their possibles and get out. Tom Fitzpatrick might die in bed, but how many times had he come within a hair of going under? He hadn't turned gray overnight for no reason at all. Tall, grizzled, hard-muscled, Fitz had been one of the biggest and best of them, until that day in 1831, when his hair turned white. Most of the flesh wasted from his bones, and, too weak to stand, he had been found by 2 half-breeds crawling along a creek bottom. One day, when alone on the Big Sandy, he had come face to face with a band of Grovans, and had raced for his life until his horse fell dead under him. He had then crawled into a hole in a mountainside and filled the entrance with stones and leaves, and had remained there until almost dead of hunger and thirst. Crawling out, he had headed for Pierce Hole, but while crossing swift waters on a raft, had lost his rifle, pouch, and knife. Defenseless, he had had to climb a tree and sit in it all night when attacked by a pack of wolves. There were no words, Sam supposed, to tell how much a man suffered whose hair and beard turned from brown to white in a few days. When they came to the big bend of the Musselshell, Sam and Lotus gathered a pile of dead cedar boughs and stripped off their clothing. Sam then fired the pile, and they stood naked in the heavy smoke, holding their garments in their hands. It is possible that Sam overrated the red man's sense of smell, because his own was so acute, but his years in Indian land had convinced him that often the red man could smell an enemy when he could not see or hear him. He had concluded that the white man had a strong body odor of which he was unaware. After all, was the mountain goat conscious of its odor, or the cougar, or the wolf? With the wind coming from the beasts, Sam could smell a pack of wolves 5 miles away. He had got to know the body odor of all the man-killing beasts, and of such birds as the horned owl and red-tailed hawk. But it was the odors of red people that had been his special study. Until now, by odor alone, he could distinguish between Blackfeet and Crow, and between these and the Cheyennes and Utahs. When he saw the 4 warriors the woman had chopped down, he would have known by their body smell that they were Blackfeet, even if he hadn't known by the shape of their moccasins or their headdress. After he and Lotus had saturated their pores and garments with cedar incense, They turned their moccasins inside out and smoked them, for there was no part of man with a stronger odor than his feet. If their paths were found, a score of Blackfeet warriors would go down on hands and knees to sniff at the footprints of horse and man. Chapter 8. When on a late September day they looked over at the woman's shack, there was no smoke or sign of living thing. After staring for a full minute, Sam said, "I don't see hide or hair of her, but I feel she's there." He went down to the river trail and followed it to the lean-to. Nobody had been there in a long while. On the path leading to the river he saw her tracks and took the path up the hill. She had been sitting just inside the hut on her bed. He was never to forget how she looked the moment she came in view, standing there by the shack, the rifle in her hand, her body bent forward, eyes staring and ears straining. "It's me," he said in a loud voice, for he was 150 feet from her. "It's Sam Minard, your friend." For 2 or 3 minutes they looked at one another and nothing more was said. He thought she had a very crazy way of staring at him. Putting a hand behind him, his fingers motioned to Lotus to go back down, for he suspected that the woman had seen her and recognized her as Indian. He then advanced, slowly, until he stood before her and looked down at her gray hair. He thought it had turned gray since he saw her last. Father in heaven, how she had suffered! "I'm your friend," he said, and looked over at the sage plants and the wild flowers by the graves. The wetness of the earth around them showed that she had watered them within the past 2 or 3 hours. Nowhere was there any sign that she had made a fire. Still moving slowly, lest she become terrified and scream, he set his rifle by the wall and took the gun from her hands. "I guess you fired this since I left," he said, "because it isn't loaded now." She hadn't yet looked up at him. Thought of her sitting with an empty gun before her enemies filled him with such pity and pain that he placed a hand lightly on her graying head and kissed her hair. "I'm your friend," he said, his voice low and gentle. Then he took his rifle and went back down the hill. He couldn't stand any more of it. He was afraid he was going to break down and cry like a child. To hide his emotion from Lotus, he said they would go out and get a couple of deer. But even after they had come in with them and he was slicing liver for her, he felt sick clear down to his guts. The trouble with deer and antelope, he said to make talk, was that they didn't have the full-bodied chewing of beef. He guessed it would be all right to make a fire here. The skulls were still on the stakes. The Blackfeet had scouted this area perhaps a dozen times. They had read the warning. They would never strike here. Not now. The woman up there, she looked as if she hadn't eaten a thing since he left her. She was scrawny and gray, and so full of sorrow that it made a man want to cry, just to look at her. His rifle within reach, he knelt to slice venison, and Lotus brought wood for the drying racks. The larger intestines he cut into lengths about 18 inches long, and turning them inside out, took them to the river and thoroughly washed them. With a hatchet he laid open the spine and the shoulder and thigh bones to get at the marrow, for he intended to have boudins tonight. Lotus came over to see what he was doing. She hadn't got used to the fact that he liked to cook and had a gourmet's interest in food. She invariably looked astonished when he gave a cry of delight over some delicacy. She preferred a slice of raw liver to his warm golden biscuits, dunked in hot marrow, and the service berry to any other berry. But when he was feasting and exclaiming, she had learned to smile and exclaim with him, and to say, "It's all free," after hearing him say the words 100 times. She hadn't the slightest notion of what a white man meant by the word free. Boudins she did like, and she watched with fascinated interest as he prepared them. When he heard a meadowlark, he stood straight and tall and listened. Its song was so much finer than the meadowlarks back east. This he took to be a sign that these mountains were a better home for a man than the hills of New England. The purple finch had a marvelous warbling song that was continuous. The orchard oriole's welcome to springtime was almost as fine as the bluebirds. The hermit thrush in the high, cool canyons sang as he imagined the angels must sing, but this solitary vocalist of the prairies and fields, with its yellow vest and black cravat, was his favorite of all songbirds. He listened until it flew away. "I wonder," he said, "if she ever hears it." He now put the marrow and the tenderest part of the kidney fat in a frying pan and melted them. The choicest flesh of the tenderloins he minced, using his hatchet and knife, along with a portion of liver, 2 kidneys, a cupful of brains, and a pound or 2 of hindquarter taken close to the bone. And all this minced meat he mixed with the rich marrow and suet greases, sprinkled the compost with salt, squeezed over it the juice of a wild onion, and stuffed the whole of it into several lengths of the intestine, with one end tied off. When the boudins were ready for cooking, each was about 10 inches long and tied off at both ends. It had taken him an hour to prepare them for a slow broiling or roasting. He now turned to the biscuits and steaks, but paused every minute or two to glance round him and listen. Lotus meanwhile laid slices of flesh on the drying racks and kept up the fires. A man and woman in love preparing their supper was the most beautiful thing in life. Didn't she think so? No taxes, he told her for the 20th time. No policemen, no laws. The odorous abundant earth turning over in its garden of good things round and round, its face following the sun, like a child its mother. He was mixing biscuit dough. Rib steaks and a large roast were laid out, ready for the fire. He hadn't left her much flesh to dry, had he? He asked, looking at the slaughter he had made of 2 carcasses. Tomorrow they might find an elk, though this was a long way from elk country. When the supper was almost ready, the roast and steaks brown and dripping, the boudins gently simmering in their hot juices inside the gut sleeves, the biscuits ready to bake, and the coffee to set on, he said he guessed they ought to go up the hill and ask the woman to eat with them. He supposed she wouldn't, but they ought to ask her anyway. The rifle over his left arm, his right arm gently across his wife's shoulders, he went up the hill. And the moment Kate heard their footfalls, she reached for the gun. With Lotus behind him, now Sam went forward, knowing that her gun was not loaded, and Lotus followed, peering round him, for he had told her the story of the woman, and she was curious. Sam called her attention to the graves and their flowers, and black eyes looked back and forth from the graves to the woman. She knew that the mother who stood there, looking so frail and alone and frightened, had 3 slain children buried under the withered flowers. Taking his wife's hand, Sam said to Kate, "We're your friends." He watched her face, hoping to be able to tell if she understood him. "We have a fine hot supper down by the river. We wonder if you would come eat with us." Before he was done speaking, he knew that she would not. The way she sat and everything in her face told him that she wanted them to go, that she wished to be alone. She looked terribly thin in her huddle of clothes, and very white and tired and old. Kate's next response amazed him. Apparently, she had been only dimly aware of Lotus, if at all, and now she saw her as an Indian, for she screamed, and the cries of the loon, the bittern, the hawk, the grebe, all together were not as blood-curdling as this woman's cry. In the moment of the scream, she ran frantically to her bed just inside the cabin and began to paw in it for the axe. Her cry had been so dreadful, so unhuman in its hate and fear and desperation, that Sam was unnerved, almost shattered, his bronzed face turning a shade paler. He seized his wife's arm and moved swiftly back. The woman had found the axe, but had got entangled in something and was struggling to get up. And because she was so weak, so desperate with fear, she screamed again, and in all his life Sam had never heard such a sound. He moved back again, back and back, until he and Lotus were almost 100 yards distant. And there he stood, shaken and unbelieving, his eyes fixed on the creature. She could hardly in that moment have been called a woman, who crouched at her doorway and peered, the axe in her grasp. "Almighty God," he said. He felt nausea all through him. He felt that he was going to cry like a child, and he was trembling, clear down to his moccasins. Sensing at last the pathos of it, the ghastly woe of it, the broken mother heart of it, he took his wife's arm and went down the hill. The supper had been spoiled for him. All the beauty and sweetness of the earth had been turned bitter for him in that moment when he grasped in full measure the loneliness and nightmares and stark, insane wondering of a mother there with her dead children. He ate one of the rich boudins, a steak, a hunk of roast, and a half-dozen biscuits, and he drank a quart of strong black coffee. But he was hardly aware that he was eating. He then folded one of the deerskin's flesh side in, making a bowl of it, and in the bowl he put a skin of boudins, a piece of roast, a steak, and a few biscuits. He told Lotus to remain here, alert, hand on her gun, while he went back to the woman. If the woman were somehow to get away from him and rush at Lotus with the axe, she was to shoot her, if she had to, or climb a tree if she could. With his rifle he went up the hill with the hot food, and over to the woman, who now sat between the graves. And he set the skin of food right before her, turning the folds back so that she could see what was there. He didn't speak and he didn't linger. He supposed that she would recognize the food and that she would ignore it or throw it away. What could he do, or what could any man do, that was any good for her? Was there in the whole world anything that could break through such grief as that? Perhaps the Almighty could do something for her. Perhaps he was doing it in the only way that it could be done. Sam's guess was that she would sink deep into sorrow, and from sorrow into death. But he didn't understand her. He might reasonably have asked what man could. He would never know of her frenzied assaults on the killers that invaded her small world, or that she had totally forgotten her people. If he had known about her visions in the sage garden and her reading and talking aloud to her dead ones, he would have thought only what Bill was to say, that she was as crazy as a loon with 3 eagle babies in its nest. Kate, on her side, would have found it hard to understand the red men and the mountain men, who month after month shot thousands of healthy, beautiful animals and took only a few pounds of flesh, leaving the remainder to the wolves and vultures, who found delight in waging savage war against one another, who caught and killed lovely creatures, such as beaver and otter, and for no more than their skins. She could hardly have understood Sam Minard, for on a high mountain spine he would beat his chest in a raging storm and call on the Almighty to look down on the world he had made. The next day Sam and Lotus brought 3 deer from the hills and built fires and jerked nearly all the flesh, and this Sam put in skin pouches and took to Kate's door. He wanted to touch her hair a moment with palm or lips before going so far away from her. But her attitude told him that she wanted him to get out of sight. And so, without saying another word to her, he took his wife and headed up the river. The cottonwood and aspen were putting on their yellow cloaks, the chokeberry its scarlet. The river, done with its goaded spring torments, was a broad flowing of clear waters, borne down from the highest mountains. It was a beautiful day. A meadow lark was singing exquisitely in 2 octaves. Morning doves and owls foretold the coming of rain. When, having passed the Big Bend, Sam saw the far blue mists of mountains south of the Yellowstone, he told his wife that yonder were the Wolf and the Rosebud summits, and the northernmost summits of the Bighorns. The ebullience of his emotions, spilling all day long into spontaneous enthusiasms or into song, was new to her. Her people were emotional, but they didn't exclaim with delight over such things as flowers, the swift sudden dive of a dabchick, the strange duck sounds of the snipe's tail feathers, the juicy ripe flavor of a wild plum, the wing markings on what he said was a swallow-tailed butterfly, a badger's footprints. After they swam the Yellowstone, they were out of Blackfeet country, and she thought her man seemed to feel that he had no enemies. He would burst into song, he would shout at her, to draw her attention to the things around her. "There," he said, pointing to the blue and purple belt of peaks lying east and north of the Bighorns. She looked and saw only mountains and mist and distance. A map of the whole vast sweep of it was in Sam's mind: the Yellowstone, Bighorn, Wind, Powder, Green, Snake, and a dozen other rivers, and all their valleys, and the Little Snake, the Yampa, the Uintas, and 100 more. He had decided to stop long enough to say hello to Bill Williams, if he could find the sly, lean old codger holed up in some thicket between Medicine and Bald Mountains. From the Bighorn River, which he had been following upstream from its junction with the Little Bighorn, he turned east, and pointing to 2 peaks, he said to Lotus, "Somewhere between them, if he isn't dead yet." Bill wasn't dead, and he wasn't asleep. Early in the morning, 2 days later, Sam was walking and leading his beasts as he pushed his way through tangles and thickets, when suddenly a high, shrill voice cried, "Do you hear now? I was nigh to giving you hell. I was. If I didn't think you was a Blackfoot after my topknot, I'm a lying nigger. I surely be." A moment later, there he came, tall, cadaverous, gangling, a rifle across his arms and his right hand on the trigger guard, his bright, almost glittering gray eyes peering out under shaggy brows. The face Lotus saw had a long, thin nose, lean, bearded cheeks, and a narrow forehead, with veins standing out in the temples. He had a high-pitched, almost whining voice that made some men think he was crying. Around his waist hung a lot of contraptions, including a queer-looking bullet mold, and all with a deer horn handle in a sheath of cherry wood, hand-carved by him, and a vial made from the tip of an antelope horn, in which, in season, he carried his castor bait. Bill had begun life as a Methodist preacher in Missouri, but, according to his story, every time he appeared at the church door, the rooster shouted, "Here comes Parson Williams. One of us goes inter the kittle today." One morning, when preaching at his fervent best, a girl in a front seat got his mind so mixed up that he decided he wasn't born for preaching. He took his gun and headed west. "Wow! Tie up my boudins!" he said, ambling over. "If it ain't Sam Minard. And who is this here at Philly?" "My wife, Bill, Mrs. Samson John Minard, the most beautiful woman in the world." "Well, now," said Bill, squinting his small, keen eyes at the girl. "If this nigger sees good, she don't look bad at all. Wherefore be you headin'?" "Uintas. I need 4 or 5 packs, for I have a wife to support now." "They cost, I've heard. You best spend a night with me, I reckon. I have some of Hank Caddy's huckleberry preserves, and the best buffalo hump you ever tasted." They spent the night with Bill. After supper, the men and the girl sat by a small fire, and Lotus looked at Bill most of the time, for he was spinning tall yarns, and his facial mannerisms fascinated her. If Sam asked a question that touched Bill's emotions, the sunken face would turn grave, the eyes would narrow to slits of light, and Bill would knock the pipe out and fill and light it before uttering another word. "Ivor Carlson, you say? That be a sad tale, Sam. We was hunting last spring. It was over on Shields River." "Well, now, I dotta knowed better. I'll be dogged if I shouldn't. That time of year, the Blackfeet is all over the place. I tell you, Sam, Ivor was as full of arrows as a porcupine, with one sticking plumb through both cheeks, another stuck deep in his meat bag, and 6 or 7 in his hump ribs. I took them out, but it was like butchering him almost. But he wore mountain man, whoa, and he never give off more than one little grunt. And I'll be dogged, that was when I cut the arrow out of his boudins. That one was so deep I could feel the point against his backbone. Of course, the one stuck through his cheeks, I just whacked the head off it and pulled it back out. But the one in his meat bag, it was plumb buried too. And that doggone one in his boudins, I had to slice him open so I could get inside." Listening to Bill's high-pitched words, Sam's mind went back to a blizzard 3 years ago, when he had spent a night with Bill on the headwaters of Bear River, near Sublette Mountain. About 40 feet from their fire had stood Bill's old, grayed-over and grizzled pack mule. Its guts filled with western bunchgrass and cottonwood bark, it stood, half dead with cold and age, and sound asleep over its picket pin, its limbs drawn a little under it, its rump in the blizzard, the stark bone of its back arched in the driven sleet, the whole weathered skinny carcass wavering a little from side to side, as, disturbed in its slumber, it opened its eyes a narrow slit to survey the storm. Now and then Bill had looked round him with piercing intentness at the driven white winds, but always in the end his gaze came back to his faithful mule, and at last he had risen to his creaking legs and said, "I'll be dogged if I don't think I'd best put a robe over Balaam. It ain't as warm here as it was in Moab, and he do seem to be shivering powerful hard." "Ivar live?" Sam asked at last. "I'll be dogged if he didn't. But didn't old Hugh Glass live? It takes a lot, me boy, to kill a mountain man." For breakfast, Bill gave them what the mountain men called French dumplings. After mincing buffalo tenderloin and hump with marrow and hump fat, and rolling it into balls and covering these with flour dough, he simmered and fried the dumplings in marrow. Sam swore that he had never eaten a better breakfast. The hot biscuits he spread with Hank's huckleberry preserves, and with biscuit filling one cheek and dumpling the other, he listened to Bill's yarns and drank 2 pint cups of hot black coffee. He smoked 2 pipes before bringing his beasts in. "Bill," he said, falling into mountain man argot, You get down our way this fall, we'll set up such a doggone feast, it'll make you give up cooking. Well, now, I expect you would. How about Christmas dinner? Sam wouldn't expect him for Christmas or for any other time. He knew that old Bill Williams was a loner who never visited any man, but took his solitary way from hideout to hideout. "What's your topknot?" Sam said when he was ready to take off. "What's yourn?" said Bill.